Hello, everyone. This is Eva Nolik-Smith with Yoga U Online, and I am very pleased to be here today with yoga teacher Natasha Rizopoulos, founder of the Align Your Flow style of yoga. Many of you will know Natasha from her extensive work with Yoga Journal as a DVD instructor and also as a frequent presenter at Yoga Journal conferences. And some of you may have seen the most recent profile of Natasha in LA Yoga. Congratulations on that one, Natasha. That was a beautiful article.
Thank you.
Natasha has been a teacher of teachers for more than 20 years, first as an instructor with YogaWorks and now as an instructor of yoga teacher trainings at Down Under Yoga in Boston. And she's particularly well known and widely regarded for her unique ability to make sophisticated postures and ideas into something that is more easily understood and which really has a transformative effect on one's understanding of yoga. And for the last decade, Natasha has refined her method of teaching into an approach that empowers students to make connections between the alignment of the body and the mind, including the physical and the spiritual. And that is what Natasha refers to as her Align Your Flow style of teaching. So Natasha, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
So glad to talk with you.
So first of all, tell us about your yoga style, Align Your Flow, and what inspired you to create it and what characterizes this approach to teaching and practicing.
I have a sort of funny hybrid yoga trajectory. I spent about 10 years as a daily Ashtanga practitioner, and I really loved my Ashtanga practice, and that linking of breath and movement, the repetition, the use of the sun salutes, the way in which the practice can be so meditative, because in a classical Mysore room, you are doing your own practice on your mat and working on an individual basis with a teacher, but it's not a group class. And there is just something that is very internal about that practice, which I loved. And I felt that for me, my decade of Ashtanga really, it made me physically stronger, but it also made me emotionally and sort of psychologically stronger as a person. Like that came at a point in my life in my late 20s and 30s when it was really great to have such a strong practice. But as I said, there was also this very meditative element that I loved about it. And then I sort of grew out of my Ashtanga practice. It no longer really served me. And I had always been very captivated by the Iyengar method. I used to go to Iyengar classes on moon days, when you're supposed to take a day off. And always just so, just profoundly admiring of that system and of the way that they tailor the practice to individual bodies, and the way the use of props, the use of modifications, the way that basically all of the classes are really themed, so that the sequences are really just intelligently constructed. So when I stopped practicing Ashtanga, I really had a primarily Iyengar practice, but still flavored by my Ashtanga background. And so Align Your Flow really came about as I was trying to come up with kind of a description for my teaching and my practice, because it was neither Ashtanga nor Iyengar, and those are such distinct and beautiful systems. And I was trying to figure out, well, what is it that I do? Because I never taught either Ashtanga or taught Iyengar. I just practiced them. I always did something else in my own teaching. And really, it was just this realization that I think at its best, asana can really align us on every level. So I'm very interested in physical alignment. I think that, the teachers who have inspired me are all practicing into their 60s and 70s, and I hope to do the same. And all of them have very alignment-based practices. I don't think you can place the demands on your body that a strong, rigorous asana practice can place unless you are really practicing based upon sound principles of anatomy and alignment. And so the physical alignment is key. But for me, there's also this way in which when you use the physical alignment as a way of focusing the mind and of really engaging with utter focus
Mhm.
what you're doing on your mat, to being fully present, there's a kind of, I mean, I hesitate to use this word, but a kind of almost a spiritual alignment that happens as well. There's a way in which you kind of find your central axis, not just
Yeah.
physically, but also in every other way.
Yeah.
And that's that idea of align your flow, because I do teach a linking of breath and movement. I don't think the flow that I teach is what many people are doing in flow classes, at least from what I hear anecdotally. I teach more slowly. We hold postures for longer, but there is that linking of breath and movement. I do, the sun salutes are a very big part of both my practice and my teaching. But it's this idea of physical alignment as an entree into a deeper alignment with the self, capital S. That's how we arrived at align your flow.
That's beautiful. Sort of integrating an element of mindfulness and calming of the mind by virtue of the focus in the pose.
And this way that, when you are in flow, and all of us have experienced that, whether it's on the yoga mat or elsewhere, but
Mhm.
that sense of suddenly like everything comes into focus,
Right. Right.
that clarity, there's that sense of who you are, who your best self is, what you bring. Do you know what I mean? There's just a
Mhm.
different awareness of yourself and of your relationship to the world and to whatever it is that you're doing.
Mhm.
And I feel like I experienced that on a consistent level when I began practicing asana.
Mhm.
That I had glimpses of it before, but that
Mhm.
that I really found it on the yoga mat when I was practicing a certain way, and that's what I want to share with my students when I'm teaching.
Yeah, there is an element I noticed when I started holding the poses longer. It's a really interesting exploration because first you go through the phase of getting frustrated and annoyed and overwhelmed, and then you can kind of go beyond that and just begin to study what's happening in the pose. How can I stay in this pose with the physical discomfort and make it more interesting? And how can I, in a sense, move beyond the physical discomfort and study all the fine elements of what's really going on in the pose? That's a very fascinating exploration that begins to happen in longer holds.
Exactly, and I mean, my concern sometimes when I hear how quickly people go through their practices, sometimes just staying for a couple of breaths in a pose, is that you don't really have time. As
Mhm.
you say, there's all these stages. So there's the initial shock sometimes, but it's like to stay long enough to figure out what the actual actions are, as opposed to just surviving
Right.
the pose.
Right. Right.
Okay, what's lengthening? What's strengthening? What do I need to engage so that I feel stable? Where do I need to press down so that I can create a lift? All of that can't happen in 3 or 4 breaths. That sometimes
Right.
happen in 15 or 20 breaths, and
Yeah.
beyond, of course, the changes that can happen physically when you do stay for a little bit longer. You do become stronger. You do be visible. You kind of get a little bit more control of your vehicle when you're having to be present that way.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Now, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about one of my favorite group of yoga poses, hip openers. Hip openers, particularly when you are first introduced to yoga, can be really dramatic in terms of the effect that they have on mind and body. They can be one of the most soothing and calming groups of poses. And I always wondered, what is it about hip openers that is so unique and special that they can have this effect?
Well, I mean, I have so many things to say, but the first thing is I think that if you just think about how most of us spend most of our lives, everything is closed all the time. You're sitting, so the fronts of your hips are closed.
Mhm.
You're we're just constricted in so many ways. And a lot of hip opening is about expanding outward, whether it's
Mhm.
adduction where the legs are spread, whether it's external rotation when we're, turning the femur in the hip socket. Of course, the big one for so many people is lengthening the hip flexors, because in this increasingly sedentary world, that congestion in the front of the hip is, I mean, it's so handicapping. I see the effect on people's low backs, and it's really quite intense. And then, of course, there's the whole emotional component, which I still 20 years in, I don't understand it intellectually, but I know experientially, both from my own experience in poses and from teaching for 20 years, what I've seen,
Mhm.
that there is a way in which there's no doubt about it. People store emotions in their hips.
Mm.
And again, it's one of these sort of woo-woo things that I remember hearing and sort of being like, well, explain to me how that is. And I've yet to hear a sort of really specific scientific explanation, but it doesn't matter because I have experienced it and witnessed it. And so
Mm.
I think there is this very profound thing that happens where there some kind of emotional breakthrough happens, especially in a lot of the pigeon variations.
Mhm.
And I think what's interesting is that often in life off the mat, when you have strong feelings,
Mhm.
they're kind of overwhelming. And so then people try and stop the feelings on some level, because it's too much. And yet, when deep emotion bubbles up in an asana practice, if you've been breathing and paying attention and present for the hour leading up to that pigeon pose, you're equipped to handle those strong emotions differently.
Mhm.
And the other thing that I think is interesting is that I think in that moment where sometimes a big feeling arises, or it's almost like a wave that engulfs you, perhaps in your normal life, you would be tempted to try and analyze it or intellectualize it.
Right, right.
Instead, when it happens in the context of asana and in the context of breath and having already moved,
Yeah,
there's some way in which I think people are able to just be present with it and not try and change it and
yeah,
to literally just experience it. And if that's not the essence of yoga, I don't know what is, right? I mean, what
right,
we're doing in meditation is learning to observe our thoughts without reacting to them, right? And
right, right.
to just kind of have a kind of curiosity and a witnessing,
Yeah,
um, not judging, not editorializing, not changing, not responding, right? And
mhm,
that's what we're learning to do in asana. I mean, I think of asana in many ways as preparation for meditation.
right,
And so I think that when this stuff comes up, as it inevitably does, you handle it differently than you would if you weren't on your mat. And there's some way in which also if it's a class that you feel supported and safe in,
yeah,
you don't have to kind of have a big conversation about it. There isn't a big drama. There's just this sense of it moving through you.
right,
And that I think is extraordinarily powerful, that
yeah,
something significant happens and yet there doesn't have to be a big drama about it. You just are with it.
right,
I think asana trains us for that on a physical level. We were talking about the difficulty of holding a challenging pose for longer than might feel comfortable.
right,
Fairly quickly, you learn that it doesn't help to make a lot of funny faces and grit your teeth. You just
right, right.
breathe and notice.
Yeah,
And that's very powerful.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And at the same time, as rewarding as hip openers can be, they also can be one of the more common sources of injury if not approached correctly. Could you talk on that?
Yes. I mean, I cannot tell a lie. When I first began practicing, the way that pigeon, since we're talking about pigeon, was taught was basically the teacher would dim the lights, say the Kleenex are at the front of the room, I'll be back in 5 minutes. Pigeon is this incredibly powerful pose, not just on in terms of the emotional breakthroughs that can happen, but physically it's very, very demanding and it needs to actually be taught. Like anatomically, there's a lot going on
mhm,
that needs to be addressed and very specifically taught and propped. And as a teacher, you need to be walking around the room looking at all of your students from a variety of different angles so that you can
mhm.
protect the knees, so that you can protect the sacroiliac joint. You need to
Right,
give the information so that if students fall in love with a pose and they decide to do it at home, they can do it at home safely. And
yeah,
there's just there's you know there's a lot of actual teaching that needs to happen so that someone can then settle into the pose,
right.
have whatever happens happens. But you as a teacher need to create a context responsibly, and
Yeah,
physical context, it's very, very important.
yeah, yeah,
I know of, unfortunately, a lot of people who ended up really injuring their knees by doing a lot of pigeon without proper instruction, without proper support.
Mm.
So, I mean, it's very funny, when I was a new and a very new teacher, my teacher, Mati Ezrati, didn't want us to teach pigeon. It was forbidden because she felt that so many people got injured in it. And then one day I was in the Ashtanga room with her. She was actually practicing and I saw her doing pigeon. I was like, what are you doing? Oh, okay. So one can teach it. One just has to actually teach it.
Know what you're doing, yeah.
Since we're talking about hip opening, when I was a new teacher, I feel like I had such a narrow idea of what hip opening was. Like to me, hip opening was anything where the legs were turned out. That's the tip of the iceberg. I mean, the hip is a ball and socket joint. And this is where as teachers, you really need to understand the anatomy. And so a ball and socket joint is designed to move on every plane.
Right.
So for me, hip opening means that you have the appropriate range of motion in every single direction that your hip is supposed to move in. So that means hip flexion. And in order to have good hip flexion, you need to have length in your hamstrings. That means hip extension. Well, in order to have hip extension, you need to have length in your hip flexors. That means that you have the strength to abduct and the openness to adduct. I mean, all of it, the abduction, when you abduct the leg, the outer hip engages. Right. But in order to abduct, you need to have strength in the outer hip and length in the inner thigh. So there's all these different elements that I think often, again, people just have such a narrow idea of what actual hip opening is. And when I teach hip opening, typically in my public classes, on a given day, my public classes are usually an hour and a half. I'll say, we're going to look at 2 elements of hip opening. But I always try and be explicit so that people understand this is 2 pieces of like an 8-sided, object. And that's really important because I think people sometimes get fixated on a couple of aspects of hip opening.
Absolutely.
There's a whole circle that needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think by extension, you tend to think about poses like pigeon poses, hip opening poses. And I remember really being quite surprised when I was a young teacher to find out that Warrior One is a hip opening pose, triangle pose is a hip opener. Pretty much most standing poses are hip openers.
And in fact, I mean, again, sometimes I think people make the mistake of not spending enough time on standing postures because in the standing poses, you have this beautiful opportunity to both open and strengthen simultaneously. You can't practice a standing pose without simultaneously lengthening and strengthening. And that muscular containment is a very, very important part of opening safely so you don't overdo it, And I just think that in any class, it's very important to kind of, I like to start supine often, especially with hip openers, and then go up to standing, and then go back, move back down sort of on the energetic arc, but also on the physical arc, from the ground up and then back to the ground with the prone hip openers or more supine hip openers or some seated ones. But I think it's really important that you spend time doing the upright stuff first to prepare the body so that you don't overdo it when you come to the ground.
Very interesting. This is sort of a side tangent, but there is this presumption that regular yoga practitioners sometimes develop what's called as acetabulum impingement syndrome, where the head of the femur begins to shape itself in a way that creates impingement in the hip socket. And I can see if you're always in the same hip opening pose that could begin to happen, that the bone will begin to reshape itself to adjust to that constant force that's being put upon it. So I would imagine variety is just incredibly important.
I really think so. And I can actually speak to this from my own experience a little bit. I did go through a period where I was basically doing the same poses all the time. Like it was when I stopped attending Mysore classes and I had my own practice at home. And I was really interested in building timings in that kind of Iyengar way in specific postures. And so I did fewer poses for much, much longer. Because, in Ashtanga, you're in a pose 5 to 8 breaths. And on the one hand, I think I certainly got stronger. I had
Mhm.
one kind of strength in Ashtanga. This was a different kind of strength. But I really did start to feel that my hips, I was doing a bit of a disservice. And,
Mm.
sometimes when I talk to long-time Iyengar practitioners, they are finding that less and less they're wanting to do those very long holds. And I think it's one of the reasons it's so important. I mean, I really believe in home practice. I think it's a very powerful way of practicing. But I also think it's important to get to classes, no matter how senior you are as a teacher,
Mhm.
because it's important to be exposed to different postures, not the ones that you tend to always do. And
Right.
I
Yeah.
mean, as a teacher, one of the ways that I keep it fresh in my own practice is I pretty much always practice what I'm about to teach. Do you know what I mean? So I do it myself. And since I'm
Mhm.
obviously trying to keep things varied for my students, I keep my own practice varied in that way. But it's still so important to go to other teachers'
Right.
classes, because they do things that you just don't think of doing, and
Right.
it does keep that range of motion from
Yeah.
getting too static.
Yeah, that's very interesting. One of your writings that kind of struck me was how much spillover effect you feel hip openers have into other aspects of our practice. So I'm quoting you here. You say, the feet, legs, and hips are crucial elements of a well-rounded practice. When we cultivate these elements, the effects can be felt throughout one's practice, improving poses like inversions, arm balances, back bends, and sometimes surprising and dramatic ways. End quote. That's a tall order.
I mean, the thing is, it's funny, in a kind of increasingly vinyasa-oriented world,
Mhm.
I feel like people are so focused on their upper body strength and their shoulder strength.
Mhm.
And that's good. But I want people's lower bodies to be as strong and I keep using this word, but as intelligent as
Mhm.
their upper bodies. I mean, I think people's hands should be their toes rather, should be as lively as their fingers.
Mhm.
So, when we work in standing poses, you strengthen your legs, and that leg strength has a huge impact on inversions, on arm balances. I mean, it's counterintuitive. People think you're upside down, but no, in Shirshasana, you need to be pushing up through your legs as much as you're pushing down through your arms. And similarly with arm balances, I think people think that, oh, I
Mhm.
can't do arm balances because my shoulders aren't strong enough. And it's like, well, maybe, but it's also because A, you don't have the mobility in your hips, and B, you don't have the strength in your legs. I mean, I
Interesting.
remember a very, very adept student of mine. I mean, she has a beautiful practice, and she couldn't do a classical Vashisthasana, meaning where you sweep the leg up and hook onto the toe, not just keeping the ankle stacked. And she said, I want to have a private session with you on this, because I just feel like we need to open my hips more so that I can do Vashisthasana. And we practiced a little bit, and then I said, no, it's because your hip flexors aren't strong enough. I said,
Mm.
you have the openness, but you don't have the strength. So we did a lot of work to basically intelligize her hip flexors. And
Right.
boom, there she goes into the pose. And of course, people understand they need to lengthen their hip flexors. You can't spend, more than a week doing asana without realizing, gosh, this sitting is really bad for my hips. But people don't realize that as much as they need to lengthen their hip flexors, they need to strengthen them. And to me, strengthening the hip flexors is an aspect of hip opening,
Mhm.
because you can't do a lot of the hamstring work, the hamstring lengthening pose,
Mhm.
if you don't have strength in your hip flexors. You always have to be thinking about both sides of a joint.
Yeah.
There's always, one more layer. And sometimes when somebody is stuck in a family of poses, they think it's because of one thing. Oh, XYZ is weak,
Right. Right.
maybe.
Yeah.
Or the thing on the other side is tight.
Right.
And how can we address both of those?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a beautiful point. And we're so excited because you have a course on Yoga U online about hip opening. So tell us about what you'll be covering.
Well, this was a fun one for me because I wanted to be very methodical about it. I wanted to try and address as many elements as I could. So the first session, I really am focusing on supine poses. We're calling it, from the ground up. So
Right.
the first session is really looking at what I think of as these kind of paradigm postures, like Supta Padangusthasana 1 and 2, which address, obviously lengthen the hamstrings and the adductors, but also we look at Supta Padangusthasana. I bring a kind of anatomical lens through. We explore Supta Padangusthasana through this idea of the planes of movement, the sagittal, the transverse, the coronal planes, and using the planes of movement, using that anatomical lens to really understand exactly the movements and the positions of the pelvis in Supta Padangusthasana.
Cool.
And from that very basic pose, we start to expand out and out into other hip openers, and then eventually to the standing poses, but always coming back to that kind of anatomical lens. Anyways, the idea is to work with kind of essential postures that I think are absolutely foundational and sort of fundamental to not only starting to, on a physical level, open your hips, but also to understand in terms of alignment and anatomy, how to kind of extrapolate from your experience in these quite simple poses. Supta Padangusthasana 1 and 2 are poses that you would teach in an intro to yoga course.
Right.
In the standing pose session, I look quite specifically at Vrikshasana, tree pose, another pose that you would teach to a raw beginner.
Mm-hmm.
But both of these postures can actually be very, very advanced if you understand the nuances, the subtleties of the alignment, and again, using this sort of anatomical language of the planes to really, in a very precise and quite nuanced way, make subtle adjustments with your pelvis that can transform the poses. So, I teach tree pose in my advanced master class for teachers, and people are just pouring sweat, because we work very precisely. And so it's some of that work that I'm excited about sharing in this course. Again, like simple poses taught with a lot of precision. And again, with, I hope, a kind of way of using anatomy so that what you understand in Supta Padangusthasana 1 and 2, you can then apply in a pose like Utthita Hasta Padangusthasana 1 and 2, the standing version. Or apply in something like Hanumanasana, which is a very advanced posture. But at the end of the day, everything that you learn in Supta Pada applies in Hanumanasana. So that's the kind of and then those are the connections that I like to make.
Yeah, and I would imagine with these very simple poses, it's a great way to observe your students, so you can find out who are the tight hamstring people, who are the tight adductor people, who are the hypermobile people in the group, all sorts of important things that you really need to know as a teacher.
And that's the thing. I think, I'm sure most teachers have already figured this out, but you want to start with postures that are simple enough that people can hold for a little while, so that in those simple postures you can start to introduce a lot of alignment information, and people are not so overwhelmed that they can't take it in, but also you have time to see, that piece of the puzzle that person's really stuck on. That's interesting. They can do everything else I'm asking them to do, but that's the piece they can't do. That's going to come up later too. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
This idea, again, I come back to Supta Padangusthasana, which is a pose that I often begin class with, and we'll spend a couple of minutes in one and a couple of minutes on two, and then the other side. And there's a lot of information being shared, but people are supine, they have props, they're not overwhelmed, they're not under duress, and they can start to get used to my language, so that then by the time we get up into our first Trikonasana, I've already given most of the instructions in Supta Padangusthasana too, and the way in which they're then able to make that connection.
Yeah, I think you're too modest when you say a lot of yoga teachers have already figured this out. I think it's your signature approach to sequencing to start with those very simple actions and very simple poses, and then really build up from there. And I think you should give yourself credit where credit is due, because you are a master of that, and it's not easy to find what those actions are and then build them up. It's one of the signature elements of your teaching, I'd say.
One's always trying to share what you care about. And I think that sometimes newer teachers think they need to teach many poses. No, teach them like with great depth. Somebody came up to me after class the other day and she said, I don't understand it. She said, I sweat more in your class than in the hot yoga classes I go to. You know, I have any heat on, we've got the windows open.
Right.
But it's true. I think when people go more slowly and more in depth, they have a completely different experience. And it's not just about the sweating, obviously, it's about what's the connection to the pose, you know, and my job is to help students make their own connections, you know, and yes, I'm trying to articulate it for them, but I also want them to have those aha moments, you know, because
Yeah.
then, you know, I said the other day in class, we did a pose that was very hard for everyone that I teach very infrequently. So it was a little bit of a shock to everybody's system. We were doing a full Bekasana, and which is frog pose. And the frog pose for the hip flexor is not the one that people sometimes think of.
Oh.
And I said afterwards, I said, I know that was hard, but what do you feel like now? Not what you felt like in the pose. What do you feel like now? And that's an important piece, you know, that people work very hard, because in the aftermath of working hard, there's a pause, there's a child's pose. And if you ask people to notice what their brain is doing or what their energy is or what their attention is, it's often very calm and focused, you know. And I think that's such an important piece, that people pay attention to how they feel after a pose, not just in.
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I could keep you here all afternoon, but I know you have other things to attend to. So, Natasha, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for sharing of your great wealth of knowledge about yoga teaching. We very much appreciate it, and we're very much looking forward to your course.
It's always a pleasure.
All right. Thank you. And everybody, thank you so much for listening in. Namaste. Bye-bye.